when a homeless boy suddenly shouted, "Don't eat that!" No one could have predicted what would happen next. The park cafe was a hotspot for the city's elite, nestled between perfectly trimmed trees and the soothing hum of a nearby fountain. At midday, it was alive with energy. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved effortlessly between tables, balancing trays of artisanal dishes and freshly brewed coffee. The air carried the warm scent of freshly baked bread, mingled with the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. Yet for one man, none of this was remarkable. Seated at a prime table in the center was Bernard Green, a name that commanded power and wealth. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting with real estate in his 20s and expanding into ventures that most could only dream of. Now, at 72, he exuded the confidence of someone who not only ruled his own world, but perhaps controlled the worlds of those around him. His sharp suit and gold-rimmed glasses reflected a life of luxury. And yet, as he skimmed the menu, there was a slight hesitation in his movements. Across from him sat Marissa, his much younger wife, a woman who looked as though she had stepped straight out of a magazine cover. Her jet-black hair framed a flawlessly made-up face, her bright red lipstick perfectly applied. Every inch of her screamed elegance, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. She idly twirled the diamond bracelet on her wrist, more focused on the screen of her phone than on the man sitting across from her. Just beyond the cafe's patio fence, a boy lingered. He was small for his age, his oversized hoodie draping loosely over his thin frame. His dark eyes darted from table to table, scanning plates and pockets, searching for an opportunity. His name was Malik, though no one in the cafe knew it. Still, his face was familiar on this street, a kid with nowhere to go, always hovering on the edges of conversations, the outskirts of concern. Bernard glanced at his watch. "You're distracted again," he remarked, his tone calm but firm. Marissa looked up, flashing a smile that held no warmth. "I'm right here," she said sweetly, reaching across the table to place her hand over his. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Malik's stomach growled. He moved closer, his footsteps barely making a sound as he leaned against the railing, eyes locked on Bernard's table. It was the kind of meal he hadn't seen up close in months, a pristine white bowl of soup, fresh bread, a sparkling glass of water. Then, something caught his eye. As Bernard adjusted his glasses and picked up his phone, Marissa's hand slipped into her designer handbag. Malik watched as her fingers wrapped around a small vial. With effortless ease, she twisted it open, and that's when he shouted. With a subtle tilt of her hand, Marissa let a few drops slip into the steaming bowl. The liquid blended seamlessly with the soup, vanishing in an instant as if it had never been there. Malik's breath hitched. He froze, watching as she casually stirred the soup with her spoon, her expression perfectly composed. Then she leaned in toward Bernard, her voice low but just loud enough to be heard. "After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now." Malik blinked, his mind racing. Had he really seen what he thought he had? Could a woman so flawless, sitting in a cafe this elegant, actually be doing something so sinister? But deep in his gut, he knew something was very wrong. His heart pounded as he crouched lower behind the railing. He wasn't entirely sure what he had just witnessed, but the icy edge in Marissa's voice sent a chill through him. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. No one else had noticed. No one else was paying attention. It was just him. His stomach growled, briefly pulling him back to reality, but his eyes remained locked on the couple. Bernard looked tired, distracted. His spoon hovered over the bowl as he checked his phone. Across from him, Marissa was all charm once again, her smile radiant, her posture relaxed, as if she hadn't just whispered something chilling moments ago. A weight pressed down on Malik's chest. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. Why get involved? Who would believe a kid like him, a boy in a threadbare hoodie, invisible to a world that barely acknowledged his existence? He swallowed hard, glancing around the cafe. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of silverware. Everyone was lost in their own world. No one noticed him. No one cared. But then his gaze snapped back to Bernard's spoon, dipping into the soup. Malik's chest tightened. It wasn't just in his head. He had seen her pour something into it. He knew what would happen if the old man took a bite. His mind raced. He didn't know this man, but that didn't matter. Right was right. Wrong was wrong. The moment stretched endlessly. And then, without thinking, Malik pushed himself off the railing and strode straight to the table. His legs felt heavy, but he didn't stop. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't eat that!" Heads turned. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Somewhere, a fork clattered to the ground. Bernard froze, his spoon inches from his lips. His wide eyes locked onto the boy. Marissa's head snapped around, her expression hardening in an instant. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice razor-sharp. Malik didn't waver. His voice was shaky, but strong enough for everyone to hear. "She put something in your food. I saw her. Don't eat it." A ripple of gasps spread through the cafe as every patron turned to watch. Then, silence. A thick, suffocating stillness settled over the space. Malik stood his ground, chest rising and falling with deep, adrenaline-fueled breaths. Bernard blinked, his gaze darting between the boy and his wife. His voice was calm, but as he set his spoon down, his hand trembled. "Marissa, what is he talking about?" Something in Marissa's composure snapped, like a rubber band stretched too thin. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "You little liar!" she hissed, venom dripping from every word. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" The words stung, but Malik didn't back down. His eyes remained locked onto Bernard's, pleading for him to see the truth. "I saw her," Malik said, his voice steadier now. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. If you don't believe me, smell it." Bernard's face paled. Slowly he turned toward his wife, his expression tightening. "Marissa," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What's going on?" She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, please, he's just trying to cause trouble. Look at him, he probably just wants money or food." Her words were laced with disgust, her gaze flicking to Malik with open contempt. But Malik didn't flinch. He stepped closer to the table, fists clenched. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice rising. "She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything." Bernard hesitated, his hand hovering over the bowl. Disbelief warred with the creeping doubt in his mind. Something about the boy's unwavering tone made him pause. The air around them thickened. The cafe, once alive with chatter, now eerily still. All eyes were locked on the unfolding scene, their meals forgotten. Bernard leaned back slightly, studying Malik with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze. He was a man accustomed to people trying to manipulate him, take advantage of his wealth. But this felt different. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't look away. "Malik, is it?" Bernard asked, his voice measured, though a trace of suspicion remained. Malik nodded. "Yes, I'm telling the truth. Please, don't eat it." His voice was softer now, but insistent. Marissa let out a harsh, humorless laugh, crossing her arms. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her tone ice-cold. "He's just some street kid looking for attention. Are you really going to entertain this nonsense, Bernard?" Marissa snapped, but Bernard didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the spoon again, this time bringing it closer to his face. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet storm brewing inside him. His gaze locked onto hers. "Marissa," he said slowly, his voice dangerously calm. "You heard him. What exactly is going on here?" A flicker of something, panic maybe, crossed Marissa's face before she masked it with indignation, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I can't believe you're even asking me that. It's insulting." She turned sharply to the growing crowd, her voice rising. "He's lying. Look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me?" But her words didn't have the effect she'd hoped for. The crowd murmured, their eyes shifting between the three of them. Whispers rippled through the air. Did she really do it? She looks nervous. That boy doesn't seem like he's making this up. The soft hum of doubt only fueled Marissa's anger. Her polished composure shattered as she slammed her hands onto the table. "Enough of this! Bernard, eat your damn soup and let's go!" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. But Malik wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his fists clenched tight. "If you won't believe me, then call someone to test it," he said, his voice rising with urgency. "You're rich. You have lawyers, doctors, people who can figure it out. But don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it." Bernard's jaw tightened. He turned back to the bowl, the spoon still in his hand, but he didn't lift it to his lips. Instead, his tired, calculating eyes shifted to his wife. "Marissa," he said, his voice low, "you've been acting strange for weeks now. This—" Her face flushed. She opened her mouth, but the words stumbled out clumsily. I don't know what you're talking about." Bernard didn't blink. "You can't seriously think I wouldn't notice." His voice turned razor-sharp. "Poison me?" he finished for her. The cafe gasped audibly, the whispers swelling into a wave of hushed shock. Malik stood firm, his pulse hammering in his ears, but he wouldn't let it show. He had done what he could. Now it was up to Bernard to decide what happened next. Marissa straightened, her expression hardening into something cold, something unrecognizable. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to this," she said, grabbing her handbag. But before she could turn away, Bernard's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." Across the cafe, a waiter, who had been frozen in shock, finally stirred. A voice finally broke through the tense silence. "Sir, should I call the police?" the waiter asked. The question sent another ripple through the cafe, and for the first time, Marissa looked genuinely panicked. She shook her head violently. "Don't you dare! This is just a misunderstanding," she snapped, turning to Bernard. "You can't seriously—" But Bernard raised a hand, cutting her off. "Yes," he said, his gaze still locked on her. "Call them." A flicker of relief rushed through Malik, but it was short-lived. The truth wasn't out yet, and the tension in the air remained thick. As the waiter hurried inside to make the call, Bernard finally let go of Marissa's wrist. He never looked away from her, watching as the polished charm she usually wore like armor slowly crumbled. Desperation seeped through the cracks. She glanced around, lips moving soundlessly, searching for an escape. A few steps back, Malik felt his hands tremble. He had done what he could, but now doubt crept in. What if Bernard didn't believe him? What if she found a way to twist the story in her favor? He clenched his fists, willing himself to stay put. "Malik," Bernard said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension. "You said you saw her put something in the soup. Can you describe it?" The boy nodded quickly and stepped forward. It was a small bottle, like the kind used for medicine. The liquid was clear. She poured it in when you were looking at your phone, then stirred it. "I swear I saw it." Bernard's face hardened. He turned to Marissa, who was already shaking her head. "This is ridiculous. He's lying. Why would he lie?" Bernard interrupted, his voice sharp. "What could he possibly gain from this?" A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the cafe. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, adding to the charged atmosphere. Marissa's eyes flickered toward the soup, and for a brief second, her carefully crafted mask shattered. She looked cornered. Then, as if grasping at straws, she turned on Malik. "You've been spying on us, haven't you?" she accused, her voice dripping with venom. "Trying to cause trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something?" The words hit Malik like a slap, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not jealous," he said firmly. "I saw what I saw, and I couldn't just stand there and let you hurt him." The sirens blared outside, and within seconds, 2 police officers entered the cafe. The room seemed to shrink as they approached the table, hands resting on their belts. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his voice neutral but authoritative. Bernard straightened, his towering presence still commanding respect, despite the turmoil unfolding around him. Bernard turned to the officers, his voice steady despite the turmoil. "Officers, I need you to take a look at this," he said, gesturing toward the bowl of soup. "This boy claims my wife poisoned it." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them leaned down, cautiously sniffing the soup before straightening and turning to Marissa. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this?" Marissa's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous. He's just a street kid trying to stir up trouble," she snapped. Then, turning to Bernard, her voice edged with desperation. "Are you really going to let this nonsense go this far?" But the officer wasn't swayed by her deflection. "We need to test the contents," he said, reaching for the bowl. "No!" Marissa's voice shot through the cafe, sharp and panicked. The sudden outburst only made her look guiltier. The officer froze, narrowing his eyes. "Ma'am, is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed?" Marissa hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her eyes darted between Bernard and the officers, hands trembling as she clutched her handbag. Then, finally, her composure cracked. "Fine," she spat, her voice low but seething with venom. "You want the truth?" Her lips curled into something bitter. "I'm tired of living in his shadow, tired of him controlling everything. He was never supposed to make it past this year. And She stopped abruptly, realizing too late that she had said too much. A collective gasp swept through the cafe. A few patrons instinctively reached for their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Bernard's face went ghostly pale as the weight of her confession hit him like a sledgehammer. The officer stepped forward, his expression grim. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them." Marissa's entire facade shattered. She thrashed, trying to break free as the officers secured her hands behind her back. "You don't understand," she screamed. "I deserved everything he had, everything." Her voice echoed through the stunned cafe as they led her away, her protests fading into the distance. Bernard sank into his chair, his hands shaking as he shoved the bowl of soup away. For a long moment, he just sat there, his expression a mask of disbelief and betrayal. Then, slowly, his eyes lifted to Malik, who stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The anger in Bernard's face softened, replaced by something else, something Malik hadn't expected: gratitude. Because Malik hadn't just saved his life, he had uncovered a truth Bernard never would have seen coming. Around them, the cafe buzzed with hushed whispers, the air still thick with shock. Some patrons glanced at Bernard with pity, others with curiosity. But Malik didn't move. He wasn't sure if he was supposed to stay or quietly slip away. Bernard turned to him, his voice softer now. "Malik," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. Sit." Malik hesitated, his eyes darting to the onlookers. But something in Bernard's voice carried a weight that made him obey. Slowly, he sank into the chair, his shoulders still tense. Bernard exhaled, his voice low but steady. "You saved my life." His gaze was firm, filled with something Malik couldn't quite place, gratitude, maybe even admiration. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Malik shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. I couldn't let it happen," he mumbled. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing." Bernard nodded, his eyes distant, as if replaying everything that had just happened. "Most people would have," he said after a pause. "They would have looked the other way, pretended they didn't see. But you didn't. That took courage." Malik shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't like seeing people get hurt. That's all." For the first time, Bernard really looked at him, not as just some street kid, but as someone with a story, with depth. "How long have you been out here?" The question caught Malik off guard. He looked away, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "A while?" Bernard frowned but didn't push for more. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. "Wait here," he said, stepping away to make a call. Malik watched him, anxiety twisting in his stomach. Was he in trouble? Was Bernard calling someone to have him thrown out? But when Bernard returned, his expression was calm, almost kind. "Help is on the way," he said simply. "Help?" Malik's brow furrowed. Bernard nodded. "I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a safe place to sleep tonight. And if you'll let me, I'd like to do more than that." Malik's eyes widened. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly, his voice instinctively defensive. "I didn't do this for money or anything." Bernard smiled faintly. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I want to help you. You did something today that most people wouldn't. And trust me, if the world had more people like you, it would be a much better place." For the first time in a long while, Malik felt something unfamiliar. Warmth. Safety. He looked down, unsure of what to say. Around them, the cafe slowly returned to normal, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air. Bernard picked up his glass of water, taking a slow sip before speaking again. "Sometimes, life gives us the chance to change someone else's story," he said thoughtfully. "You changed mine today, Malik, and maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours." Malik met his gaze, his dark eyes glistening with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. As they sat in silence, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cafe. And for those who had witnessed the events of that day, the lesson was clear. Courage doesn't always wear a suit, and kindness doesn't always come from those with wealth. Sometimes, the people we overlook have the greatest strength of all. In the end, Malik's bravery didn't just save a life. It reminded everyone in that cafe of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds.